Welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever felt like modern politics is, well, less about passing actual laws and way more about putting on a giant show? Today, we are diving into a really fascinating, highly debated thesis from Daniel W. Marshall's book, Big, Beautiful Bluff. We're going to neutrally unpack his central argument that recent U.S. governance, specifically under the Trump administration, systematically favored theatrical spectacle over the painstaking, sometimes boring work of actual policymaking. Whether you follow politics obsessively or you're just kind of curious about how modern communication is completely changing the nature of our government, this breakdown is going to give you a clear, structured look into Marshall's critique.
So, jumping right in, Marshall's primary argument in Big, Beautiful Bluff is that the Trump administration actively bypassed traditional, detail-oriented governance. Instead, they manufactured what he calls the myth of legislative genius. Basically, this is the illusion that complex legislation isn't a civic process requiring compromise and endless patience, but rather a prime branding opportunity. It's the idea that a leader could just swagger into a room, throw down a few thunderous words, and magically leave a glorious, fully formed law in his wake. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the legislative genius myth, the mechanics of the bluff, case studies of what he calls the broken bills, the financial realities, and finally, the legacy of bluffing. Let's start right at the top with Section 1, the legislative genius myth. This is Marshall's foundational concept of turning a complex civic process into pure theater. The author grounds his entire critique in this vital concept of legislative theater. According to Marshall, legislative theater happens when the spectacle of announcing a law takes absolute precedence over the substance of actually drafting it. It's the idea that a policy doesn't even need to make sense, it just needs a really strong name. The crowd doesn't need to understand the structural framework, they just need to feel the promise. And that promise itself essentially becomes the product. Think about how we consume news today. We almost always remember the grand announcement, right? But we rarely check back to see if the structural framework was ever actually built.
Marshall provides a stark, really memorable contrast here to explain this shift. He suggests that traditional lawmakers act like exacting engineers. They are sober, they're poring over blueprints, worrying about the load-bearing strength of the legal language they use. In contrast, the author argues that Donald Trump approached policy like a real estate tycoon walking onto a messy construction site with a Sharpie, pointing at the structure and demanding, "Make it gold." He didn't want to negotiate the messy plumbing of the policy. He just wanted the golden elevator of spectacle. Moving right along to Section 2, the mechanics of the bluff. Let's look at the specific language tactics used to pull off this theater.
According to the book, the mechanics of this bluff relied heavily on emotional packaging. Repeated phrases like big and beautiful acted as the packaging rather than actual policy frameworks. Marshall points out that at first, these words felt aspirational. They felt like a movie trailer for a blockbuster political miracle. But because there were absolutely no numbers, no specific policy terms, and zero actual frameworks behind them, they eventually just turned vague promises into national catchphrases. It was like being sold a miracle cure. Actually, scratch that. It's more like buying an empty bottle that just has a really flashy label.
All right, Section 3, case studies, the broken bills. This is where Marshall takes his theory and applies it to the real world.
The author highlights 3 specific initiatives: the border wall, healthcare, and infrastructure. He uses these as his prime examples of bluff politics. Marshall argues that in all 3 of these cases, massive, historic announcements were made to the public, but there were 0 structural blueprints backing them up. Let's break these down one by one according to the text.
Focusing first on the border wall, Marshall argues that the repeated rally chant, "Mexico will pay," was never at any point an actual diplomatic plan. It was never rooted in a formal agreement. Instead, the book describes it as a theatrical illusion. It was a call-and-response trick meant to shift the debate entirely and create a sense of identity among supporters. It didn't require proof, only repetition, basically turning an incredibly complex geopolitical issue into a catchy 3-word slogan. And this brilliantly illustrates the budget bluff. The author notes how the estimated costs for this wall just wildly shifted over time. It started at $5 billion, moved to $5.7, ballooned to $18, and eventually drifted toward estimates of over $25 billion. Why such a massive gap? Because, as Marshall points out, the project didn't actually exist on paper. The numbers didn't have to be accurate, they just had to sound powerful for the television cameras. Moving over to healthcare, the book posits that repeal and replace was essentially an empty chant. For nearly a decade, it was the ultimate battle cry. But Marshall argues that when it finally came time to act, the legislative cupboard was entirely bare.
Instead of presenting an actual viable replacement plan, the strategy relied heavily on fear-mongering, things like the persistent death panel myth to whip up outrage. It's a stark reminder of how political strategy can prioritize TV ratings and drama way over actual health outcomes for everyday citizens.
Similarly, Marshall argues the promised trillion-dollar infrastructure plan was entirely performative. It was an illusion where grand, sweeping speeches were made in front of heavy machinery, but no detailed cost breakdowns ever materialized. Ultimately, this constant cycle of grand announcements without a single shovel hitting the dirt turned the phrase Infrastructure Week into a literal national meme for administrative dysfunction. So let's dive into Section 4, the financial realities. Here, the author contrasts all that glowing rhetoric with the actual economic outcomes. Marshall closely examines the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Now, this legislation was heavily branded to the public as a middle-class miracle. However, according to his analysis, the middle-class benefits were specifically designed to phase out over time, while the massive cuts to the corporate tax rate were permanent. The book argues this was a total masquerade, basically a corporate giveaway dressed up to look like populist relief. The absolutely crucial number to remember here is $800 billion. Marshall notes that in 2018 alone, companies used their massive new tax windfalls to repurchase over $800 billion of their own shares. Think about that for a second. Instead of the promised trickle-down effect of higher wages and brand new factories, the author argues this artificially inflated stock prices, enriching executives and shareholders while leaving the working class with essentially the exact same economic struggles they started with. The budget realities also extended to government operations. The book heavily critiques the historic government shutdown over $5.7 billion in wall funding. Marshall describes this event as a temper tantrum and reckless political theater. While the administration demanded billions for a wall that still had no comprehensive blueprint, actual federal workers, Coast Guard members, and air traffic controllers paid the very real price. They were missing paychecks and visiting food pantries just for the sake of a televised standoff. Finally, we reach Section 5, the legacy of bluffing. Let's look at the long-term danger of normalizing this specific style of governance. The author warns that bluff politics has stopped being just a campaign tactic and has unfortunately evolved into an actual, full-blown governing philosophy. When you replace institutional competence and the boring, super difficult work of legislating with pure spectacle, you corrode public trust. People begin to expect theater instead of solutions. It makes them increasingly cynical, turning political loyalty into a form of intense fandom rather than a demand for real, tangible results. And Marshall warns that this isn't just about one single administration. He urges us to consider the blueprint that has now been laid bare for future campaigns. It shows exactly how easily spectacle can replace substance if the public just allows it to happen. Which leaves us with a genuinely chilling question to ponder. What happens when the next genius steps up to the podium, having watched this masterclass in misdirection, ready to bluff even bigger? Will we, as a public, demand substance over spectacle, uncover the fine print that screwed the public, and read the full story today? The Big Talk, The Broken Bills. Grab your copy of Daniel W. Marshall's Big, Beautiful Bluff at https://nybook2.nc0106. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and we'll catch you next time.